Good afternoon, everybody. We'll give folks just another minute or two to get in the door and get settled, and we'll start momentarily. I see folks still coming in, so I'll give folks just another minute. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Justice Services Learning Collective, our fall speaker series featuring Dr. Holt. This speaker series is focusing on trauma, and so far we have covered an overview of trauma and trauma-informed practices, trauma and race, and today we're going to be talking about trauma and involvement in the criminal justice system. Our expert is Dr. Damond Holt, who is a PhD in trauma and has extensive experience in many areas involving this. I'll let him speak to his experience here shortly. We want to remind everybody that this is the work product of Dr. Holt. We are recording these for view afterwards, and we will make the link available on our YouTube channel. If anybody needs that YouTube channel, I'll be posting it in the chat in case this is your first time and you want to be able to catch up on the previous presentations. Dr. Holt will be available for questions at the end of the presentation, so any questions that you might have, please go ahead and drop them into the chat, but we will remain mics off throughout the entire presentation itself. And with that, I will say thank you so much to Dr. Holt. We've been loving this series and have greatly appreciated your time, and I'm really excited about your presentation today.
Is this the one?
Yeah. There we go. So I see it. So this is where I can share my video. Here. So,
I don't know
can we
why
see
it
me?
won't let your camera up here. Okay.
We are. All right. Sorry for that. We just had minor difficulties, so thank you for your patience as we strive to correct those. Again, so my name is Dr. Holt. So I am a certified traumatologist. I am a trauma specialist. I am a mental health specialist as well. And pretty much my job is as an expert is to look at how trauma impacts the whole person, impacts the whole person. So impacts, excuse me, the brain impacts the mind. As a result, it has its ramifications on behavior. And when we look at trauma, it as well impacts our memory. And so we're going to be talking about that, especially getting deeper into this type of specialized traumatization. It impacts the body. It impacts the spirit of an individual. So there's a spiritual piece as well as there's a mental and emotional piece. Again, as I said before, trauma impacts the whole person. So many times you've heard me say before in our last episodes in this series is that trauma may not be your fault, but certainly it is your responsibility to heal from trauma, because if you don't heal from trauma, as a result, you're going to bleed on people that didn't cut you. In other words, because you're hurting, you're going to inflict hurt on other people. And so we like to say in the mental health, behavioral health arena is that hurting people hurt people, and that is the truth. And so another thing when I talk about trauma is that trauma may be your history, but trauma does not necessarily have to be your destiny. And what I mean by that is that we may have had some life devastating things happen to us that has created these traumatic experiences through pain and brokenness in your past, but it does not have to determine the rest of your future. There is something called resilience above trauma, and having grit to rise above the different things that has happened to us. Frederick Douglass said that it is far easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And so when we talk about early childhood trauma and some of the things that has happened to us, it explains why we have some of the psychological and psychiatric symptoms and issues that we have in our adulthood. So today we're going to be talking about a specialized trauma where I'm really excited for, because a lot of times we've heard about trauma-informed this, trauma-informed that, but I'm going really deep and really going into another level in dealing with how does prison impact the brain? How does going to jail and being confined impacts the brain? And what does it look like to be confined in state and federal penitentiary? And what are those psychological ramifications of being in incarceration and in being in confined, in controlled spaces? And you're going to be surprised to realize is that many people that come out of prison or have been incarcerated in the county jails for a nice length of time sometimes do not come out the same way that they went in. That is because of the fact that perhaps prison does have an impact on the brain of an individual. And we're looking at when we're looking at studies and looking at case studies and looking at testimonials and surveys, qualitative and quantitative surveys, we're realizing that prison is more than just punishing someone. It's more than just consequencing the crime that was committed. It does have these mental and emotional ramifications that a lot of times that we don't consider is because a lot of us just don't care about prisoners. We don't care about inmates. We don't care that much about the incarcerated population in our nation and our communities. And we sure don't really care about their mental health and their behavioral health. But the fact of the matter is, what are we correcting? Many of our prison industries are called the Department of Corrections. My question is, what are we correcting? And are we really correcting, or are we just simply punishing? And ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about punishment and incarceration, it is exacerbating more mental and emotional issues. So when we also talk about re-entry, far as people being released from prison and re-entering our populations in our communities, a lot of many of the men and women that come out of being incarcerated is really not the same person. And I know that, especially if they on probation, they get out due to probation or parole, that they must have a job, they need to have housing, they need to be showing some type of progress. But sometimes that's a little bit more difficult if we have not really examined what has prison and what has jail ramifications has had on individuals who've been locked up. And so today we're going to be talking about the traumatization of incarceration. The traumatization of incarceration. Is incarceration playing a strong role on the mental health and the behavioral health of individuals who have been incarcerated? And I would tell you yes. We know that prison, obviously, we have to have some type of correctional facility. I get that, right? We have to address some of the harsh crimes that is a danger to society. But I believe that we're realizing that there is a strong difference between being hard on crime, or what we would say tough on crime, versus being smart on crime. And I think that when we began to look at what are we doing to the whole person, because most people that go to prison is going to be released someday, whether for short term, long term, unless they've been convicted with a full life sentence or the death penalty. Most individuals that's going to be incarcerated will be coming home one day. With that being said, what is the condition? Because again, if we're saying that our prison industry, or the Bureau of Prisons, is the Department of Corrections, the question is, what in the heck are we correcting? And so when we're talking about this, we don't really analyze the mental and emotional state of individuals that are coming out. We're so quick to rush them, say, hey, you're on parole, you're on probation, you got to get a job, you got to make sure that you don't drop dirty in regards to a drug test, we got to get your housing, you got to get on your feet. But in order to do all of those things that we just asked that formerly incarcerated individual to do, it takes a brain to do it. You can't get a job without a brain. You can't get a job, can't get housing without a brain. You can't get job training and successfully get through that course without your brain. It takes a brain to do it. And if your brain has been injured with all of these psychological and emotional TBI standing for traumatic brain injuries, and that's exactly what psychological trauma is, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But when these life devastating things hit these inmates, it is impacting their brain, in their mind, and their human behavior more than what we think. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. This is despite the national incarceration rate between being at its lowest in 20 years. About 25% of the world's total prison population is in the United States, and which holds about 1.1 million prisoners as of when we were looking at it at 19. And what we also know is that 1.3 million in federal and state prisons, and in our county jails nationwide, we have those that are incarcerated around 745,200 in our jail system. Mass incarceration in the United States has led to several problems. Among these are overcrowded prisons, which lead to increased health risk and decreased psychological well-being. When we look at it from a disparity among communities of color, we see in the Black and brown community, and as far as our men, many argue that incarceration dehumanizes poor people and it dehumanizes minorities, and damaging already marginalized communities, and does not increase public safety. Black and brown men in prison, more than 60% of the people in prison are people of color. For Black males in their 20s, one in every 8 in prison or in jail on any given day. 3/4 of all persons in prison for drug offenses are people of color. In the Latino community, in 2009, the federal prison held over 380,000 people in immigration custody. And so, ladies and gentlemen, when we ask the question, what does incarceration or overly incarceration and probably even overly policing in poor communities and communities of color, as a result, we exacerbate an additional issue. And poor communities and African American and Latino communities are strongly overrepresented in our state and federal correctional facilities. When we look at the juvenile population, and so we also see that the traumatization of incarceration is broader than just adult incarceration, but our children, our children and our adolescents. Juvenile populations. Today, there are over 92,000 juveniles in federal, state, and local custodies. So that means that we have a lot of children that are in prison. We have many children that should really be at home with their families, but due to the fact that we sometimes overly police, and certainly in our school systems and our education systems, that we misuse the SROs in our schools, which are community resource officers, which are police officers that are contracted with school districts to provide law enforcement support. Sometimes we are seeing that many schools and school districts are misusing those SROs to be their prison guards in the schools. And when some students make a violation according to the student code of conduct, instead of discipline that child or that student within the confines of their student code of conduct, they're using SROs to arrest kids that have not broken the law and sending them to the juvenile detention center. So that's an issue. And again, as we talk about the traumatization of incarceration, is there a traumatization among our young brains, the young little brains of our young people and our children? Yes, and juvenile detention centers have a traumatic impact on our teens. I know we try to use that as a deterrent, but we're also seeing that not only is it a deterrent, or we're trying to use it, as a deterrent, but we also seeing that it is creating depression, is debilitating kids more than it is a deterrent from crime. This is why we still have repeated offenders, because of the fact that if you don't address the trauma and you don't address why there are wounds and injuries psychologically and emotionally to the brain in the first place, then you're just going to continue to be spinning your wheels and having repeated offenders. And dependent on certain states and certain municipalities and certain policies and legislation, you got a lot of 3 strikes you're out on mandatory sentencing. And we also see too many kids also fall under that 3 strikes you're out mandates that create huge disparities among young people of color as well. So this is also traumatizing, just giving you an example. So today I brought my brain today because I want you to see that this organ, one of the most complex organ in the body, our brain, can heal. When life devastating things happens to them, and we're going to be talking about how prison is extremely a life devastating situation. I mean, you don't have to have a murder conviction for your life to be impacted and for your brain to be impacted through incarceration. But this thing here, when things get crazy and you get exposed to many of the plethoras of different traumas that you are experiencing in incarceration, this thing is most definitely impacted. This brain is impacted, and this brain is not the same in many cases when they come out. And this is the reason why sometimes we still have those long-term chronic issues, even after being released out of prison. is because we have not considered how devastating and debilitating and dangerous that it is on this brain when you are living in those type of violent environments. And so that opens the door when we talked about school to prison pipeline, where kids getting arrested from the schoolhouse, arrested to the jailhouse, and some even having felonies before they're even 18. So this all impacts the mental and the emotional and the spiritual and the physical when it comes to trauma. Trauma from prison, according to the sociologist Donald Clammer, he noted in his classic book, The Prison Community, that the prison experience is neither normal nor is it natural, and constitutes one of the more degrading experiences a person might endure. I think this is what we're talking about in regards to the whys of alternatives to incarceration. I think we've heard a lot about why we do it because of financial reasons. We save more money by putting more a monitor on the ankle of an inmate or defendant versus having them sit in our county jails, which costs much more money to run, costs much more money in our correctional facilities. But I think what I'm pointing out is not only is it a financial issue, certainly it is a neurological and certainly it is a psychological issue. Another reason why we need to be looking at strategies on reducing jail populations is because of the traumatization of incarceration. We are hurting the whole person. We granted that we have to follow the law and follow the legislation, the books on the law, and we have to address criminal activity. But I think where we are at, we have to get beyond being so tough on crime to being more restorative and being smart on crime. And based on what I'm looking at in my study in regards to traumatization of incarceration, is that we are really not correcting. We're really not rehabilitating like we are promising society. And we have to do more. And one of the things about anything, if you're going to change anyone's life and help them to rehabilitate and correct their life, it's going to take a brain. It's going to take this to do it. And the sociologist Donald Clammer is alluding is that when individuals are in incarceration or in confined correctional facilities, it's appearing that it's not normal or natural, and it constitutes more degrading experience a person might endure. Trauma on prison. People in prison are likely to report that their adaptations to the constant scrutiny of guards and the lack of privacy are psychologically debilitating. Being in these spaces where obviously guards are walking around and in some spaces where some of the cells are not totally sealed off and private, but open bars, and it's very, very debilitating to have a lack of privacy and things of that nature, where you just feel less human. Also, some literature suggests that people in prison experience mental deterioration and apathy and endure personality changes and become uncertain about their identities. In other words, when the individuals are in prison and because of being in those type of spaces, that is a deterioration of their personality, their mental personality. And they have to endure these personality changes to just cope with the vicious and the atrocious environments and violent environments of being incarcerated. It does play a part on the brain while in prison. Several researchers found that people in prison may be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, you think, as well as other psychiatric disorders such as panic attacks, depression, paranoia, most definitely. Subsequently, these prisoners find social adjustments and social integration difficult upon release. So remember, I was talking about, I know when people get on parole or probation and they get early release, or they just complete their sentence and re-enter the population, and we just think these guys are just, and these ladies are okay, you know. And I'm trying to tell you that trauma is real in prison, and there are serious symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. There are serious symptoms of psychiatric disorders, and panic attacks, depression and paranoia. I mean, just constantly paranoid, not sure if you're going to get killed, not sure if you're being set up by a rivalry gang, not sure if you don't participate in a violent act and choose a side or choose a certain gang affiliation. When you come into prison, you're paranoid. As a matter of fact, it's not long before you get into prison that you're a force. It's made clear that you need to show your loyalty to some group, or show your commitment and loyalty to some kind of group. And that creates paranoia, because if you don't, then you're viewed as either being a rat, being a snitch, or being a sellout. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the struggle is real and the violence is real. So the paranoia is extremely high. And this plays a big part on the brain. I'm be talking about the neurobiological impact, just being in prison, being exposed to all of these different things. Social integration is difficult. You're becoming dissociative. You in prison, you are dissociating because of the atmosphere and the environment is so dangerous, so violent, and so unsafe. And you really can't trust anyone. So just imagine what the brain is enduring when we're talking about these things. This is your brain in jail. Other researchers found that the incarceration experience promotes a sense of helplessness, greater dependence, and introversion, and may impair one's decision-making ability. This psychological suffering is compounded by the knowledge of violence, the witnessing of violence, or the experience of violence, all too common during incarceration. Some assert that the psychological effects of incarceration developed during confinement are likely to endure for some time following release. Simply saying that the brain is so impacted that it's not just impacted by being incarcerated. When we talk about the concept that the traumatization of incarceration, its long-term ramifications are so detrimental to the psychological and the psychology of the individual being incarcerated, that even when they leave, even when they're released, even when they get on parole or get on probation and gets released into society, that there's this level of avoidance. There's this level of just cutting and shutting everything down. And it's a struggle even when we come out of being incarcerated. And so the brain is on fire because it is constantly in this fight, flight, or freeze state. It's going through this hyper arousal, and it is stuck. Because if you continue to stay and if you have a long-term sentence, your brain is stuck on high alert. It is stuck on being hyper vigilant, and it creates these other psychological sufferings that people who are incarcerated experiences. So let's look at the mental impacts of prison. Let's look at the mental impacts of prison. Some researchers argue that psychological pain of incarceration is not inadvertent, but inflicted by design. In other words, it's just not haphazardly happen. Prison, the culture of prison is not just haphazardly just happening, but there's some kind of design, some type of architect, some type of thought-provoking process to create or allow such violence and such maladaptive conditions in our prison system. Mental impacts on prison forms of punishment result from deprivations caused by a loss of liberty, material impoverished, personal inadequacy, loss of heterosexual relationships, loss of autonomy, and loss of personal security. These are some of the impacts that happens. It impacts relationships, it impacts marriages, it impacts families, it impacts personalities because of the loss of autonomy, and you don't feel safe. Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is a traumatic, very traumatic experience. When we again look more at mental impacts of prison, during the Stanford prison experience, a group of college students were randomly assigned roles as guards or as prisoners and then placed in a prison-like environment. Because the prisoner subjects experienced such intense psychological pain in the simulated environment, the researchers terminated the experience after 6 days to 6 to 8 days ahead of schedule. A number of the student prisoners experienced acute psychological trauma and breakdowns. Some pleaded for release from the environment because of the intense pain, and five were released due to the extreme emotional depression, crying, rage, and acute anxiety they suffered during the brief and mock incarceration. Wow. And it was just a simulated, it was just a mocked incarceration experience. So if individuals, researchers, and students can be impacted with acute psychological trauma and breakdowns off of a simulated type of environment, can you imagine what real life, real reality, prison jail life really is? I remember there's a show called 60 Days on the show on the network of A&E, and pretty much it pretty much is a show about ordinary citizens in the community wanting to help out the sheriff. The sheriff feels that there's some illegal things going on. The sheriff may feel in his county jail, perhaps some of his detention officers or correction officers are not doing all what they should. Perhaps there's some drug activity that some of the correctional officers allow to go on, fights and disputes go on. And so the sheriff will get wind and intel that these things are going on in his jail, but to get good intel to correct a lot of those issues, they will have individuals volunteer their time to spend 60 days in a county jail. Those sometimes have been teachers, those have been even some certified police officers. Those have been some just ordinary career people that will volunteer their time just to come into the jail to see what incarcerated life really look like. And let me tell you, I always thought this was amazing that there is a traumatization of incarceration because individuals within a week or less was already feeling extreme stress and anxiety from the impacts of being incarcerated. There was even some police officers in the show way back when that was even having some difficult times. Well, and they were even saying that it's one thing to actually put people in jail and incarcerate them, but it's another to actually just sit in the jail cell that you're putting people in and get a whole different perspective of what the incarcerated life looked like. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you that it is real. It is real because of the science. It is real because of the surveys, the research, the quantitative and the qualitative research that we do. And we all come to the same conclusion that prison and jail impacts the brain. And when people come out of jail and prison from being in there in a nice length of time, we are realizing they are not exactly the same person that the way that they came in. And so the reason why I'm doing this training and to get us to really be trauma informed, even not just in courts, not just in pretrial, not just on probation, but trauma informed in the prison itself, in the county jail itself, is going to be huge when we're looking at different initiatives and different programs, or a whole different process on how we look at alternatives to incarceration, which I really think that looking at this type of work really opens the door for a stronger and robust conversation to a restorative justice model. This is the big reason why we need to be making sure that only the right people should be incarcerated. If you have mental illness, you shouldn't be sitting in jail. We need to figure out best ways how to get you to deal with your trauma and your addiction. Because most of the time when trauma is not addressed, it impacts behavior. It impacts your cognition. It impacts your PFC, your prefrontal cortex, where you make decisions and you make choices. And sometimes the big reason why people are standing before a judge or being convicted has a lot to do with unaddressed traumas. So a lot of people have had already pre-existing traumas, and then they go into prison, and then they get these extra different layers of secondary trauma from their on top of their first layers of trauma. And then we don't fix anything, and we just release people with more exacerbated negative symptoms. So we must start looking at how does incarceration really play on people's mind. And not only mental health and substance abuse, but mental health. If you have mental health issues, we want to make sure that you're getting the best treatment and the best support possible, because perhaps some of the criminal bad choice or bad decision making had a lot to do with your mental health and your trauma. So we have to go back to the brain. We can't change the life if we don't heal the brain. Why? I'm glad you asked me, because I'm going to tell you. You can't change nobody's trajectory in life if you don't heal the brain. It takes a healthy brain to do everything. You can't do nothing without a brain. And so this is why we need to be spending more time talking about the mental health and the trauma of the incarcerated, not just mental health before they came in, but post-prison mental health. What is that looking like, and how is that impacting families and communities and individuals? And again, what our best practice is to turn a lot of that around. PTSD from prison. One who said that one story of an individual who was in prison in the state of New York. He said, I remain haunted by the memories and the images of violence. Violence I experienced, violence I witnessed, violence that I heard or learned about. He said, I can still see the murders I witnessed. He said, I can still see the image of a person being hit at the base of his skull with a baseball bat on a warm Sunday afternoon during recreation hours. The entire scene plays like a silent movie. He said, he is smashed in the back of his head and crumbles and falls to the ground. While he lays helpless on the ground, his head is smashed again and again until the sight of blood seems to satisfy his attacker. I watched as the perpetrator then calmly returned the baseball bat to the location where he had retrieved it and just walks away as if nothing had happened, while others entering the yard area walk around the lifeless body. Wow, we're talking about trauma on the brain while in prison. He said, I can recall two men engaged in a fist fight after one of them had been stabbed in the neck with a homemade knife. What made this fight more memorable than others was that one of the men fought while the handle of the knife protruded from his neck on one end, while the point of the blade showed on the other. The image still makes me grasp in awe. It was incredibly mad. I can only describe it as mad. I can still recall these attacks like they just happened a moment ago. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. That this young man has done his time in prison, spent 25 years in prison, and yet he's released from prison and still are haunted by the atrocious thoughts and nightmares. So trauma also impacts memory. He's no longer in prison, but he still have flashbacks and can remember how trauma impacted his episodic memory, impacted his emotional memory. He can remember like clear as day as if it was happening in real time. Those are beginning signs of post-traumatic stress disorder known as PTSD. PTSD from prison. He says, isolation did not help my mental state. More than anything else, he said, I recall feeling sad and depressed. He said, I felt caged. I felt alone. He said, I felt home. He said, I felt helpless. That's what trauma does, ladies and gentlemen. It impacts the brain. This is real. This is real. The real traumatization of incarceration is real. And many people, just like this brother, even some women can state some of the same things that they have experienced, seeing violence go on in the women's side of the correction facility. It's just an inmate problem, period. Whatever gender it is, male or female, you can get PTSD from being in prison. When we talk about trauma, I want you to consider the 3 E's. I said it again before, previously in our last trainings of episodes of trauma, and I'm going to most definitely bring it. And I think it really hit home in dealing with traumatization of incarceration, simply meaning that there is a trauma-related connection being in prison. Talk about the 3 E's. When we talk about trauma, we talk about the 3 E's. 1, the experience. 2, the exposure. And 3, the event. Let me say that again. Experience, exposure, and the event. Being incarcerated have a whole lot to do with these 3 levels of trauma. We know that incarceration is certainly an experience. And we also know that trauma is not only the experience, but when you get there, day 1, you are immediately exposed to the environment, the maladaptive, violent, atrocious experiences of trauma. You are exposed immediately. Matter of fact, I can go even further than that. You are exposed before you even get all the way in there. You are exposed just being arrested and being booked, and being exposed to the beginning side of being incarcerated, which can be a traumatic experience as well, just going through the booking process. And we know it's an event. It is eventful. The event itself, the actual living in the jail cell, the event itself is very traumatizing. So again, so when we talk about trauma, especially prison-based trauma, we have to consider what the experience is like, what is the exposure like, and the actual event of being sentenced and convicted and sentenced. And that's going to be your home for a matter of years, whether short-term or long-term, is extremely a serious situation when it comes to trauma. Trauma impact of violence. So what we're seeing is what is really creating these traumatic experiences, and yes, even PTSD, is the beatings in prison, the stabbings, the rapes, the gang violence, all of that. Again, we talk about the 3 E's: experience, exposure, and the events. Beatings, stabbings, and rapes and gang violence, to just name a few, really impacts the brain. And not only impacts it, but it rewires the brain. It rewires the brain in such a way that the lower part of the brain, the limbic system of the brain, puts us in survival mode. So imagine people being incarcerated for long periods of time where their brain never gets a day off. It stays hyper aroused because the lack of safety, feel like you're in danger, the exposure, the experience, and the events of seeing others being shanked and being stabbed, sexual assaults, you name it. It is traumatic, ladies and gentlemen, to the brain. And no wonder some people, when they are released, they are not the same. Their mental health has been compromised. Traumatic impact of the violence. In February publication by professors Megan Novosky and Robert Peralta, in their study, one of the first studies on this subject, Novosky and Peralta interviewed recently incarcerated people about their experiences with violence behind bars. And they find that prisons have become exposure points for extreme violence that undermines rehabilitation, reentry, mental and physical health. Let me say that again. They said that they have come to the realization that prison is an exposure point for extreme violence, not just violence, ladies and gentlemen, extreme violence that undermines rehabilitation, that undermines reentry, mental and physical health. The participants in the Novosky and the Peralta study reported witnessing frequent brutal acts of violence, including stabbings, attacks with scalding substances, multi-person assaults, and murder. They also described the lingering effects of witnessing these traumatic events, including hypervigilance, anxiety, depression, and avoidance. And these traumatic events affect health and social functions in ways that are not so different from the after effects faced by survivors of direct violence and in war. Behind bars is an inescapable and traumatizing. Violence in prison is unavoidable for many reasons. By design, prisons offer few safe spaces where one can sneak away, and those that exist offer only a small measure of protection. Novosky and Peralta's findings echo previous research revealing that incarcerated people often feel safer in their private spaces, such as cells, or in supervised or structured public space, such as a chapel, rather than in the public spaces like showers, receptions, or in their unit. However, even inside their cells, people remain vulnerable to seeing or hearing violence, and being victimized themselves. Participants in the Novosky and the Peralta study discussed graphic, horrific acts of violence they had witnessed during their incarceration: stabbings, beatings, broken bones, and attacks with makeshift weapons. Some participants were even forced in direct involuntary participation, and by being required to clean up blood after an attack, or clean up blood even after a murder. Responses to witnesses' violence behind bars can result in post-traumatic stress symptoms like anxiety, like depression and avoidance and hypersensitivity and hypervigilance and suicidality and flashbacks and difficulties with emotional regulation. Participants describe experiencing flashbacks and being hypervigilant even after being released. One participant explained, "I'm trying to change my life and my thinking, but talking about the violence, always pops up. I get flashbacks about it, just how the violence really is. In a split second, you can be cool, and then the next thing you know, there's people getting stabbed or fight breaks out over nothing." The effects of witnessing violence are compounded by pre-existing mental health conditions, which are more common in prison and in jail than in the general public. As one participant in the Novosky and Peralta study put it, prison is no place to recover from past traumas or to manage ongoing mental health concerns. I don't think prison made my PTSD worse, but it just made the PTSD I already had trigger many other symptoms. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about the traumatization of incarceration and we talk about being in prison, what are those impacts? How does it rewire the brain? How do it actually compromises our mental health, and how does it impact us emotionally? It impacts the communities, incarcerated communities, extremely hard. And this is the reason why we should be looking at better ways to be smart on crime, not so much tough on crime. Just throwing people into prison, knowing that they have mental health issues, knowing that they have addiction issues and substance abuse issues and behavioral health issues and early traumatic stress issues. This is why we need to make sure that they're getting the help they need. We're supporting them. They're getting treatment, they're getting wholeness, they're getting healing so that they can eventually be a better person. Now, we get it. When it comes to being incarcerated, we want the dangerous people incarcerated. We have to look at how we keep the murderers in our communities and the rapists and sexual people that does sexual assaults and all of that, right? That attack people that attack our children, that do violent crimes that is a threat to our society, need to obviously be incarcerated. But when we look at nonviolent offenders that made some bad choices, especially bad choices that's predicated on mental health issues, substance abuse issues, we want them getting the help that they need. We don't want those people sitting in these spaces of violence, impacting them, making them even worse than better. Is a huge concern of mine. We also have the issue of lack of medical care. There have been reports of inmates receiving the lack of medical care and psychiatric care, which again exacerbate preconditions. Abuse even from correctional staff. People incarcerated in the Zabaki Baranaskoski Correctional Center in Massachusetts filed a lawsuit documenting allegations of abuse at the hands of correctional officers, including being tased, punched, attacked by guard dogs, you name it. Now, we do know that we do have some bad behaviors in prison. I'm not going to overlook that, and sometimes we need to do to control the prison population. But there are some legitimate cases out there where even staff go way too far, and it's abusive, and that adds to the trauma of those that are incarcerated. So what is incarcerated-based trauma? It takes place when traumatic experience due to incarceration create mental and emotional injuries to the brain. So incarcerated-based trauma is very similar to all the other traumas. It's just this type of trauma is coming from being incarcerated and confined in incarcerated spaces where there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of stabbings, there's a lot of sexual assaults, there's a lot of threats and fights, and it just keep you in this hyper aroused and hyper vigilant state. This all impacts the brain. And so this is what we mean when we say the traumatization of incarceration. So trauma number one is this emotional wound. So when you are incarcerated and you're exposed to threats and you've seen perhaps even a jail cell, a homie of yours that's in the same cell get attacked or even get killed and you was exposed to that, most definitely that's going to impact the brain. Okay, so trauma is an emotional wound and it is a stress that you have a difficult time coping with it. And it's very important that we talk about those things because you can get PTSD and be traumatized by being incarcerated. And so the other gentleman that talks about even after prison, he still remembers all of these things that took place in incarceration. And while he was incarcerated, even though he's not incarcerated anymore, it's not that simple just because you leave the brick and mortar building of prison or county jails that you don't walk away with some of these things that has happened to your brain to where you have memory issues. It certainly impacts your explicit memory and it certainly impacts your implicit memory. This is why we have PTSD in the first place, because your nervous system, your nervous system is impacted by these atrocious things. And so it impacts your episodic memory and impacts your emotional memory. So even though you're away from prison, or you know some people that have gotten away from prison, been released from prison, their emotional memory is still impacted because they still can remember. Your hippocampus, your memory center, is still remembering atrocities and violence that took place that you was exposed to, and your hippocampus can helps you to remember how you felt. That's what emotional memory is. How I felt in the time that happened. And so as the gentleman was talking about, he said he was still having these haunted memories of still going back, having flashbacks, remember of what he saw and what he's exposed to. So trauma most definitely impacts memory, and it impacts brain and brain development. And we want to make sure that individuals are in more of healthy spaces and not in abusive spaces where there's a lot of violence, excuse me, and where there's a lot of lack of safety, because especially when you're young, and this is brain scan of some young person when they are in abusive situations, and this is why the juvenile detention center is a concern to me, is when we're just throwing too many kids, in particular too many kids of color, too many black and brown kids in the juvenile detention centers, that we are impacting their brain. Okay, so let me get ready to close out on the positive, talking about the traumatization of incarceration. What are some of the best practices to help people that has been traumatized, that their brain have been rewired for protection instead of connection? What did we do? What are some of the best practices of dealing with people who have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and help them to rewire the brain to feel safe again? One of the great practice is meditation. I actually have a few clients that I see that's really been through some serious, atrocious experiences in their life, and they went the last 30 years on just taking antidepressants, popping pills, taking psychotropic meds and pills, but it really didn't fix the real issue, and that was the brain is on fire, overly stimulated, releasing all of that cortisol, releasing all of that stimuli, and as a result, you have insomnia. You can't sleep. Most people that have a lot of trauma and PTSD have an issue with sleeping. Your circadian rhythm has been compromised, okay? Which impacts your biological clock to know when to stay up and when to rest. And when the brain has really been not only stressed, but have been injured, it impacts your circadian rhythm, okay? And so that impacts your insomnia. And so you can either just take pills to go to sleep, but you're going to probably need pills to get awake and get energized. If you want to get away from that, there's more holistic ways how we can repair that and get that brain to get out of that high alert state and get more into a relaxed state. But the big things, you got to have loving relationships, because relationships turns the brain from being high alert because they sense danger and reverse those effects to where they feel safe. And so it starts our relationships, but then it comes to meditation. And I am a mindful meditation expert. These are some of the interventions that I start with people who have post-traumatic stress disorder due to prison or due to early childhood education, not early childhood education, but early childhood trauma, excuse me. Meditation has been very effective to help to relax the brain. It's hard to really do any type of method of interventions if the brain is not relaxed. Psychotherapy, all those things are going to be important, but you need a relaxed brain to be able to fix a lot of those issues. So I would say get therapy, get meditation, relax the brain, yoga, many things that helps bring relaxation is really going to help you when you have these symptoms of trauma and post-traumatic stress. Get therapy. Psychotherapy is a talk therapy where you sit down with a therapist, a counselor, psychiatrist, or a psychologist, and you talk things out. You talk about the atrocious memories that you have. Sometimes you need someone to talk to. Trauma impacts families. Trauma impacts marriages. Marriages are very high. I mean, divorce is really high in marriages when trauma and post-traumatic stress has not been well addressed. There's also something called relational trauma, which is trauma that comes from relationships. And so if you're dating someone who have been experienced, who have either went to war by being in the military, being a veteran, or being in prison where the brain has drastically been impacted, some symptoms that a person might be experiencing in their relationships and in their marriages may be coming from being incarcerated, coming from trauma, coming from PTSD. So yes, you do need some psychotherapy. Psychotherapy has been known to help. EMDR is another innovative, robust type of method methodology of therapy that have been known to help people to relax, deal with people with insomnia, with trouble of sleeping, feeling sad, feeling stuck. So you may want to talk to a practitioner that specializes in EMDR. Hypnotherapy, which is one of mine. Okay, I do hypnotherapy, and sometimes when bad things has happened to people, it creates these bad coatings. I like to call it bad coatings in the unconscious mind, in the subconscious mind, which is even deeper. So we go past the cognitive, go past the cognitive conscious mind, and get into the unconscious mind. And a lot of times, a lot of the traumas that has happened to us sit down in our unconscious mind, and we have to reprogram it through putting people into a relaxed state and putting them into a hypnotic state, to get to where a lot of those deep rooted pain and brokenness of trauma sits. And this has been extremely effective on helping people to reverse their symptoms of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. So that may be something of a methodology that you want to look at. I close out with this as resilience. I put resilience last is because you need all these other support things and these support methodologies to help build resilience, plus relationships, plus restorative, plus relaxation. All of these things adds to building resilience. Listen, as I stated before, that trauma may not be your fault. It's your responsibility to heal from it. You need to heal from it. And if you're really struggling with trauma and PTSD and these things that's impacting your behavior health and your mental health, you got to start the healing process. But the exciting thing is the brain can be rewired again. Yes, trauma rewires the brain, but love rewires the brain as well. And the songwriter said, what the world needs now is love, sweet love. And I believe that love is a major key. When we look at the science, love is not just this Care Bear stuff. What we see as scientists and we see as researchers, we see there's a love hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin is released that when you get around people that you feel that you love and they love you, and they show affection through a kiss or they show affection through a hug, that there's a feeling, there's a hormonal release in the brain called oxytocin. Okay, and so that comes from being in a space of love and kindness and affection. And what we need to turn that brain down from feeling like they're in danger, feeling like they're dissociative, feeling like they have trust issues and they don't trust anybody, is that we have to get more. We need to switch the hormone from cortisol, which is your stress hormone, and switch it to oxytocin, which is your love affection hormone. This also helps bring down that high alertness and that hypervigilance and that hyper arousal that takes place when people have been so traumatized on such a high and deep level that they don't trust anybody, they dissociate from everybody, they create this level of avoidance, and they have an attachment problem as well, where they just don't attach well. They struggle building relationships and building friendships, and this certainly can be an issue in someone's marriage. So resilience is what I close out on, is that we're way more resilient than we give our credit for. And especially when we talk about incarceration and people of color. Let me tell you, in the Black and brown community, boy, we may have communities that may lack resources, and we may have families that may not have basic needs in the communities of color. But one thing we are very wealthy in, and one thing that we are very rich in, we are rich in resilience, which means that we know how to take some lickings, and we certainly know how to keep on ticking. We know how to have grit through tough times. We know how to rise above the mountains that comes in our lives and the valleys that comes in our life. We know how to rise above it. One thing about dealing with communities of color, we certainly are not turkeys. We are eagles. We know how to spread our wings, and we know how to fly above and fly through the storms of life that comes in our life. So I always like to close out on a positive note, and we don't talk about that enough, is that yes, we are dealing with a lot of racial issues. Right now, we got a couple court cases that's important that is surrounded by the racial tensions that we're seeing in our country. But even in the time of society of hate, and even in the times of society that we do see racism and discrimination and misogynistic sexism as well in our communities, let me tell you, minority groups has this special piece of resilience. And that's what I like when I look at the picture of the plant that's growing through the asphalt. And we know asphalt is very strong, very tough, and it takes a lot of strength to be able to press through some asphalt and press through some cement. But with enough strength of consistency, persistence, and resilience, we can rise above it. So again, guys, I hope that you really enjoyed this presentation. I would consider it one of our most robust trainings dealing with prison-based traumas. So always remember what Dr. Holt was teaching on today, the traumatization of incarceration. You can rise above it. And let's start rising above it right now and today. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you for the safety and justice initiative and the program, and thank you, Kate, for your leadership as director and allowing me to do this with the Justice Services for Pima County. It is an honor, it is a pleasure to serve, and my job is to help people heal. And I believe I am so blessed to have a career such as this to help people heal from all the things they went through. So again, thank you. This is Dr. Holt, and I'm out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holt. I would say the honor is really ours. It's been such a pleasure doing this series. I am so thrilled for everything that we've done so far, and I'm really looking forward to the next few sections as well. So we'll give you guys a few moments to ask any questions that you would like in the chat. While we're doing that, I'll remind you all that we do have 2 more sessions after this one, and if you know folks who might be interested in continuing in participating in the future sessions, just have them send an email to justiceservices@pima.gov, and I'll drop that email address in the chat. If they send us an email, we'll add them to the speaker series, and we'll add them to the Justice Services listserv as well. The next class will be Trauma and Incarceration Part 2. That's going to be on Friday, December 3rd, 2 weeks for today. And then we're going to wrap up this fall speaker series focusing on recovery and resilience, and that's going to be on Friday, December 10th. Thanks, Mackenzie. She put the address in there. We'll give you guys just another moment or so to see if we have any questions for Dr. Holt. And if you missed any of the past presentations, we have parts 1 and 2 of Trauma and Race on our Justice Services YouTube channel. We'll also post a link to that as well, so that if you would like to see some of the past ones that you may have missed, you are able to do so.
And it looks like we do have a hand up, so I will go ahead and give you access to your mic.
We are still learning all this technology, so hopefully we get this.
Thank you for this, Dr. Holt and Kate. I have a question about, now you focus on the victims. I have a question about the oppressors. Does the oppressors have mental illness too? What make them to become the way that they are? The corrector that do violence in the present, what make him to be like that? Thank you.
That's a very good question. So I alluded to earlier in our training is that hurting people hurt people. So a lot of times our aggressors have been victims of trauma as well, and they did not do well to heal from those things. This is also what we would consider when we start seeing bullies everywhere. A lot of times we deal with bullying behavior, we surround the victim, but we also need to address the aggressor as well, because believe it or not, a lot of people that has bullying behavior and aggressive behavior, has been victims of trauma as well. So when I look at trauma, you know, I don't have a, you know, when you only have an hour, you don't have a whole lot of time to cover. But I would like to look at trauma as a space where we really focus on the entire community. So obviously in prison, what I mean by that is we need to certainly support the victims that has been victims of trauma. But sometimes we got to look at staff. You know, I know so many times correctional guards are exposed to some of the same type of traumatic events. Seeing people get stabbed, seeing sexual assaults, things of that nature. And sometimes it's even hard to fully staff a correctional facility because of the fact that the impacts of secondary trauma on staff and on prison guards is so atrocious that it's even hard to keep some of them. So you do have to obviously support the victims, but we do have to look at the aggressors as well and see what in the world is going on. Why are you so angry? And anger management alone doesn't just fix this. We have to go back and look at the reasons why the person was angry in the first place. And usually that's a lot of trauma or early childhood trauma they never address. And so as a result, I like to look at trauma like a bacteria. And a lot of times we try to give a trauma of ibuprofen or Tylenol or Motrin, but really what trauma needs to really effectively treat that bacteria is an antibiotic. And if you treat accurately that antibiotic, that bacteria with an antibiotic, the infection begins to decrease and improve, and the symptoms began to get better. So we do have to do both, focus on the victim, but also you're exactly right there. You do have to also look at the trauma of the aggressor and help them heal, because a lot of times most of that is coming from unaddressed stress and unaddressed wounds and scars from their past as well that has not been addressed. Is there anyone else have a question?
All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat or hands up. So with that, I will say thank you again so much to Dr. Holt for joining us again today. We look forward to seeing you back in 2 weeks. And I will wish everybody who can participate today a very happy Thanksgiving. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Have a great weekend, everyone.